All right, welcome to the last video of this series. You're looking at the Arlington National Cemetery, and right there below where the gold star is, that is where JFK is buried. And you can see the eternal flame. They have a fire that's going there all the time. And I've been waiting for Assassin's Creed Supreme Court to come out, but it doesn't look like it's going to happen. So the only thing I could really do cool to finish this out was give you guys a tour of Washington, D.C. You're looking at the Pentagon right there. That's where our military basically control center is. And now you can see over to the right, the Jefferson Memorial, and to the left, the Lincoln Memorial, and in the middle, the Washington Monument. So I'm just going to show you some of the famous places in DC for those of you that have never been. If you've been, I'm sorry, but again, like I said, until Assassin's Creed Supreme Court comes out, this is best I can do. So you can see below between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, that's called the reflecting pool, and that's where Martin Luther King gave his famous speech. Then below I just zoomed in on where the Vietnam Memorial was. You can see the White House over to the left. And again, we're passing the Washington Monument. Then you have the Smithsonian Institute buildings. So you have the African American History Museum. You have the Natural History Museum coming up, which is actually pretty cool. Then you have the Air and Space Museum. All of those are awesome. I've been there myself. In the distance, you can see the Capitol building. That's where the Senate and the House meets and votes, etc. And then as we get past the Capitol building, right behind it, there are two shapes to the left. That is the Supreme Court building. And just going back real quickly in the other direction, you can again see the Jefferson Memorial over to the left, the Washington Monument right in the middle, the White House over to the right. And we're coming up on the White House, getting a little closer to it, so you can see how that's actually laid out. And again, the reflecting pool, the World War II Memorial right there in the middle. And again, going over to see the Jefferson Memorial. If you notice, the Jefferson Memorial is based on Roman architecture, like the Pantheon. And as we're heading over to the Lincoln Memorial, it's based on Greek architecture, like the Parthenon. And the Washington Monument is based on Egyptian architecture. It's basically an obelisk, which there were many of in ancient Egypt. The Founding Fathers were really loving past cultures and wanted Washington to represent all of them. Okay, so we're beginning with the United States Supreme Court. And basically the information you're responsible for is that the court and the justices who makes up the court has changed over time as history has changed in the United States. So in the late 20th century and early 21st century, we have women and minorities included. Now, pictured from left to right, you have Sandra Day O'Connor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Clarence Thomas, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan. The main job of the Supreme Court is to protect individual rights enumerated in the Constitution of the United States. So in simplified terms, they basically rule on cases whether something is constitutional or not. The United States Supreme Court identifies a constitutional basis for a right to privacy that is protected from governmental interference. For example, the two cases that are listed at the top, we have Griswold versus Connecticut and Roe v. Wade. They helped establish the right to privacy. However, you can see I added an asterisk to Roe v. Wade. I'm sure most of you are aware that was recently overturned, and that is a hugely controversial topic throughout our country today. At the bottom, we have Riley versus California from 2014, It protects the privacy of digital information. So the key here is technology is changing rapidly, to be honest. And now, for example, can the police ask you to open up your cell phone? Can they force you to unlock it, etc.? Those types of things. And there's going to be more problems that arise because of technology. For example, artificial intelligence. What are we going to do? The Supreme Court likely is going to have to make decisions regarding those types of things that the founding fathers never could, anticipate. All right, the civil rights movement of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s provided a model that other minority groups have used to extend civil rights and promote equal justice. So Loving versus Virginia in 1967, this protected equal rights for individuals. It struck down state laws that prohibited interracial marriage and held that a marriage was a fundamental right. It's hard to imagine in this day and age that interracial marriage was illegal in some states. And down at the bottom, we have Arizona versus the Intertribal Council of Arizona from 2013. This invalidated a state law requiring proof of citizenship during voter registration application process. Now, this is because Native Americans, for example, have been here before the United States was actually a nation. So that's a really touchy subject there because, again, they are forced off of their land into reservations, etc. So that's a huge Pandora's box. The rule of law is a principle under which all persons, institutions, and entities are accountable to the laws. Gideon versus Wainwright in 1963 requires states to provide counsel for needy defendants charged with serious offenses. For example, after Gideon's victory, 2,000 inmates were freed from Florida prisons. He was given a retrial and found not guilty. And down at the bottom, Snyder versus Phelps in 2011, it upholds that protests of public concern are entitled to greater protection under the free speech clause of the First Amendment. So this is a very important topic here, terrorism. The United States has confronted the increase in international terrorism by formulating domestic and international policies aimed at stopping terrorism. Terrorism is an extremely complicated subject because usually terrorists are not representative of a specific country. So therefore, when there's a terrorist attack, it's more of an individual or a small group thing rather than a country attacking another. So the pictures match up with the order of the things in the box in white. We have the attack on the USS Cole in the top left. We have the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and Flight 93. And then last, the two pictures to the far right, the Boston Marathon bombing. So as terrorism has increased, we've had to do things about it. So for example, the U.S. response to terrorism includes the Patriot Act. That means heightened security at home. We have diplomatic and military initiatives and the formation of the Transportation Security Administration. For those of you that are aware, since the TSA was formed, airplane travel has become extremely more difficult, meaning you have to go through many more security checks, and they're doing that for everyone's safety. And that's because of terrorism. We have to make these changes here at home. So how does the federal government influence the economy? Government promotes a healthy economy characterized by full employment and low inflation through the actions of, first, the Federal Reserve. The monetary policy decisions influence money supply and promote sustainable economic growth. The President and Congress fiscal policy decisions determine levels of government taxation and spending in an effort to impact economic growth. So I will readily admit that I bored myself just reading that. But here's the trick. You don't have to memorize all of these notes, especially when you see economy. Because remember, what does economy stand for? Jobs, trade, and money. So when you're reading a question on a standardized test and it's asking you which of the following is an economic effect or characteristic of this, that, or whatever, ask yourself, economy, jobs, trade, or money. Social, how people interact with each other, and government, politics. Those are how you figure that out. It's, again, history is not so much about memorizing things. It's understanding how things affect other things, how things go together, and your understanding of key vocabulary terms is going to play a big deal. Beginning with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, there's what's called the Reagan Revolution, and this extended beyond when he himself was in office. So his vice president, George H.W. Bush, was elected after him. The Republican sweep of congressional elections in state houses in the 80s, the election of George W. Bush as president, and later the formation of the Tea Party movement and its influence in the Republican Party. Just to remind you, in general, conservatism is basically reducing the amount of federal government, and that can be viewed as a positive and a negative. Again, anything throughout history, it's best to look at both sides. It can affect people differently. So on the positive side, if you have less government, you possibly are paying less taxes. But if you have less government, you have less regulation. So for example, there's less regulation on the stock market possibly, which can cause different types of issues in terms of a collapse of the stock market or a recession, etc. So also under how the federal government influences the economy, President George W. Bush, 2001 to 2009, he launched the War on Terror. He promoted policies in the economy, healthcare, education, and social security reform. He also signed into law broad tax cuts, the Patriot Act, and the No Child Left Behind Act. He obtained congressional passage of economic programs intended to preserve the American financial system. And continuing under federal government influencing the economy, we have President Barack Obama. He signed into law stimulus legislation in response to the Great Recession. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 and Tax Relief, Unemployment Insurance Reauthorization, and Job Creation Act of 2010. Next, we have technological advances, industries benefiting from new technologies. For example, we have the computer industry, satellite systems. What would we do without GPS? I mean, you guys have no idea what it was like to actually have to print a map from the internet to go on a trip. Also, telecommunications like smartphones. I mean, how do we live without that? And lastly, we have internet-based businesses. I mean, that's another thing that we take for granted. I mean, you can get groceries without even leaving your house, have them delivered. We have Amazon, where everything's delivered, free shipping if you pay for Amazon Prime. As a society, we've really benefited from technology so much. It's kind of hard to imagine living without it. And we're down to our last slide. So again, under technological advances, the impact of new technologies on American life. So to the left, we have increased domestic and international travel for business and pleasure, greater access to the news and other information, cheaper and more convenient means of communication, convenience of online shopping opportunities, and hacking and personal identity theft. That's not a positive though. But yes, that's the point. With all the advances in technologies, now we have new issues that we have to deal with as well. And over on the right side, we have social media, which is both a positive and a negative. We have telecommuting, which is working from home. Online coursework, again, going to school from home. Growth of service industries, advancements in medical research, improving medical diagnostic and imaging technologies, as well as stem cell research, and outsourcing and offshoring. So that brings us to the end of the Virginia U.S. Remediation Series. Remember, you don't have to try to remember everything, but you can watch the videos as many times as you need to. A lot of times repetition just helps things to sink in, but mainly remember economics, social, political. Remember how you can figure those out. Economics is jobs, trade, and money. Social is how people interact with each other, and government and politics. While I know history is not everybody's favorite thing, the main thing is when you're taking your test, try to look at the answer choices first. Instead of reading the question and asking yourself, what's the answer to this? That's really not fair because, again, you're really not supposed to memorize that. If you were a historian, you would be using resources in order to write your papers or do your projects. Read the answer choices and rule out the ones that are not familiar to you or that just seem far-fetched. But again, because you've been listening to this all year in terms of not just this video, but I'm saying you've heard your teachers teaching, and there's going to be certain things that you're going to say to yourself, hey, that sounds familiar. Just try to do your best. I wish you all the luck in the world, and it's been a pleasure doing this series for you.